Hey everyone and welcome to another video, guys, and today we're going to be covering Season 11 itemization. Now, I understand that there's a lot of you guys out there right now that are feeling incredibly overwhelmed on the current patch. You know, there were changes to items, power spikes, some of the stats, runes, meta, everything is completely shifted. So you may feel like you're brand new to the game. So I'm hoping by the end of this video, you feel a little bit less confused and you have at least a rough direction about what you want to do or how you want to navigate the Season 11 preseason changes. Now, because our understanding and feeling of items directly affect our perceptions of a champion's relative strength, we are understandably going to have a hard time in the following areas. We're going to have a very hard time assessing the enemy power troughs and power spikes, as well as our own champion. We're going to have a very rough time at assessing the amount of burst that is available from the enemy champion as well. So we may be giving them respect when they don't actually have burst, or we may be disrespecting when they have a lot of burst available. The third one here is that we're not going to know exactly when we should or shouldn't be itemizing defensively, which is again incredibly dangerous. And the last one is we're really not going to understand how these items are going to affect our champion's identity and the identities of the enemy champions on the opposing team. So these are all absolutely massive fundamental parts of the game that are completely gone haywire since all of these changes. So the purpose of this video, like I said before, is to give you all a sense of direction and clarity for the preseason. And remember, the meta is still unfolding, so this is just my initial thoughts given what we have seen so far. Now, for the first section of this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about stats, both the new stats that have been introduced into the game, as well as some of the changes made to already existing stats. And the first one is Ability Haste. Now, Ability Haste is now the new CDR. So in the old system, we had CDR. In the new system, we have Ability Haste. And the main thing you need to understand about Ability Haste is that it scales linearly, whereas CDR used to scale multiplicatively, which actually made CDR incredibly valuable. For each point of CDR you had, it made the next one more meaningful, which made the incentive to get 40% CDR incredibly high. Now, with Ability Haste, each point is independent to the last. And we got to remember, guys, outside of mythic items, there's only 4 AP legendary items that actually give Ability Haste. And 2 of these are defensive items, and 1 is actually a Grievous Wounds item. So this stat is much harder to itemize on the current patch than it was in the past. Now, if you want to understand how Ability Haste works comparatively to CDR in the old system, here is a little chart laying this out for you. But again, this is not really that important because we're not going to go back to the old system anymore. So now for Vamp, I don't want to go too deep on this because this can get very complex sometimes, but at a very base level, I want to explain to you what each of the Vamps actually do. And the first one here is Omni Vamp, which basically means you get healing from all sources and all types of damage, both physical and magic, and it's still only 33% effective for AoE and pet damage. So generally, this is very solid on champions with consistent damage and damage over time abilities. Lifesteal, you get healing from physical damage dealt by basic attacks, which now actually includes on-hit effects. And this is actually why Lifesteal is very effective with things like Rage Blade, and why Yone actually feels unkillable when you get to the mid-game and Yone gets to 2 or 3 items. And the last one is actually Physical Vamp, which actually means healing from physical damage dealt by basic attacks and abilities, which is still 33% effective for AoE and pet damage. This is very great for champions with physical damage spells like Lucian, obviously with the culling and things like that. And we got to remember, Physical Vamp is actually very rare and very hard to get. It's actually only on 1 item, which is Sanguine Blade, which is why, one of the reasons why Sanguine Blade is so effective on Lucian, and it's also available on the Elixir of Wrath. So this is all you really need to know, very surface level. If you want to understand more about this and how the math and things like that work, just hit me up in the YouTube comments. So now for mana, guys. So mana is much harder to come by in the current meta. There is only 1 AP legendary item that grants mana, which is Archangels, and it doesn't give Ability Haste anymore, it doesn't give the active shield, and on top of that, the tier is much harder to stack because you got to use it on enemy targets. Riot has also changed Presence of Mind, so it doesn't increase your max mana pool anymore, and we're going to talk about this later on in the video when we get to the rune changes, so don't worry. And yes, they did compensate for the lack of mana for Sheen users for champions like Echo, Fizz, and Victor by increasing their mana per level, but the mana changes on the items does significantly impact the meta. And something we need to remember, guys, and I actually touched on this in my previous itemization video, you lose the Lost Chapter Enlighten passive when you upgrade to the mythic item. On the Lost Chapter, this Enlighten passive gives you 20% max mana over 3 seconds upon leveling up. And that's an incredibly valuable unique passive given how hard mana is to come by in the current patch. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see a lot of champions actually rushing Lost Chapter, sitting on the Lost Chapter, upgrading a legendary item first, then maybe upgrading a mythic item later on as a second item. I don't know. I'm just throwing this out there, and it is something a lot of people forget when building the Lost Chapter and upgrading into a mythic item. This will also mean that blue buff priority will be increased significantly for mid laners, and mid laners will actually have to be very much on top of their resource management. So this actually is interesting for competitive play. This will mean that second blue buff invades in competitive play are going to be much more meaningful. If you are able to deny that blue buff away from the enemy Azir, or the enemy Victor, or the enemy Orianna, or the enemy Sylas, whatever it is, this is going to be much more meaningful. So it wouldn't surprise me in competitive play if we see a lot more of these second blue buff invades. But to be honest with you guys may flame me for this, but I actually kind of like these changes. Before, it felt like everyone was getting a ridiculous amount of mana between how valuable Seraphs was, how much mana you got from Presence of Mind, and things like this. It was very easy to get a bulk amount of resources. And I didn't like this because it meant people could be very blasé with the way they were using their ability. So I think this is a healthy change, and I actually kind of like the decision Riot made. So for champions like Anivia, Kassadin, and Ryze, they're going to have to significantly change their build paths. They don't have access to Rod of Ages into Archangels anymore with Presence of Mind to give them infinite resources. Anivia can't be played the same way it was played on the previous patch. All of these champions are going to have their complete champion identity shifted, right? You're not going to be able to play Anivia like a sit-back, wave-clear bot tool, play to level 16. Maybe Anivia is going to be an early game, burst-oriented control mage. Maybe you're going to be building Ludens into Horizons focus. I don't know. So what's going to happen is that these champions' identities aren't going to be the same. So over the course of the preseason heading into early season 11, we will see very creative builds, and it doesn't necessarily mean they're weak. It means they're only weak if you played them the way they were played on the previous patch. So now for Magic Pen, guys. So flat Magic penetration is very difficult to come by on the current patch. There's only 3 items in the entire game with flat Magic penetration. That's on Ludens, Rocket Belt, and Sork. So these 3 items are all incredibly valuable. And we have to remember, you may ask, what about Riftmaker? What about Voice Staff? These give percent Magic Pen. They don't give flat Magic penetration. So percent Magic Pen, yes, it's very good later on in the game, but it's not good in the early portion of the game. So this may mean that champions that previously relied on a lot of early Magic Pen to get early solo kills or get early leads will actually be harder to pilot, or at least have a lot more counterplay. So champions like LeBlanc, Syndra, Zoe, and Rumble. Therefore, these champions may need to actually alter their build path to revolve around more sustained damage and actually have a more scale-oriented build, or be willing to adapt their build from game to game depending on the amount of AP within their comp. Obviously, if they're the only form of AP on their team, then getting early magic penetration is going to be still incredibly valuable. It just means because of how hard it is to actually itemize, I think there's a lot more counterplay at stake here. So something to think about. And this actually is why I believe Ludens, Rocket Belt, and Sorks are all 3 incredibly strong items on the current patch. So now for Grievous Wounds, guys. So there's actually a lot of healing on the current patch. And there's actually 12 items in total that give healing either through Omni Vamp, Lifesteal, Physical Vamp, or just overall healing. On top of this, there is a whole lot of champions in the game with inbuilt heals, whether it's Sylas, Mundo, or a series of enchanters. And on top of this, there's also runes like Ravenous Hunter, Conqueror, and Fleet Footwork. So given all of the access to healing in the game at the moment, Riot has actually made Grievous Wounds much nicer to itemize. Oblivion Orb now only costs 800 gold and gives AP users much more flexibility within their build path. It actually builds into 2 differing items, and it doesn't just tunnel them in on some crappy Magic Pen item like it did before. Now it builds into Morello's and Chemtech Putrefier. And Riot did the exact same thing for AD champions, with Executioners giving the buyer 2 options depending on the identity of the champion. Do you want crit and attack speed, or do you want ability haste and HP? And so overall, given all of this information, I do predict Grievous Wounds to become a stock standard purchase within the unfolding meta because of how much healing is in the game right now and how easy it is to actually itemize. Now, given all of these changes made to these stats, you may ask me, Curtis, well, what exactly does this mean? What is Riot trying to do? How is this going to affect the meta? Now, given these unfolding changes, it seems to me that Riot are trying to spread stats across items so that the buyer has to make serious choices if they want a specific stat. You can't get away with the luxury of having ability haste, mana, AP, and defensive capability in one single item like we used to with Seraphs. You can't get away with having Grievous Wounds, AP, HP, and Magic Pen on one single item like we used to with Morellos. This makes itemization much more unique to each game, and every given player in a game needs to seriously consider their champion's identity to ensure they are getting max value from each and every stat. And just as a little side note here, guys, the nerfs to crit seem to make crit a much more heavy scaling stat that only truly gets value once you near 4 to 5 completed items. And given these nerfs to crit, guys, we'll likely see a much higher priority on champions that get value from on-hit itemization choices like Rageblade due to its earlier spiking nature. Even in bot lane, we're probably going to see a priority on champions like Kai'Sa over the traditional crit 80 carries because, again, it takes way too long for the crit to become meaningful. And this is actually why we're seeing a lot of those Rageblade build paths for champions like Yone. Now for early laning items. So the first item that I highlighted even in my previous preseason video was the Dark Seal. Now these Dark Seal changes were massive. It went from 10 AP to 15 AP, 100 mana to now giving 40 HP, and it used to give 3 AP per glory stack, now it gives 5 AP per glory stack. But yes, we did lose the increased healing from pots. Now, what does this mean? Now, in my opinion, my personal take on it is that we will likely see this as a replacement early base item over Doran's Ring due to it having 123% gold efficiency with no stacks, increasing by 31% per stack. And given how cheap Magi's is for a legendary item, it's only 1600 gold or 1250 with Dark Seal, which is incredibly relevant due to now the mythic passives. It's an incredibly cheap legendary item. So if you're able to get a few stacks on your early Dorans, and say you get a Ludens or a Rocket Belt or something like that, you can get, if you get an early Dark Seal, you can get a legendary item for 1250 gold. That's incredibly cheap. And if your mythic passive gives early Magic Pen, this is incredibly meaningful. So in my opinion, this is a massive buff for champions like Fizz and Echo, and quite honestly, any AP mage. So this is an item I think we will see a lot in the unfolding meta, especially across the preseason. Now, another little important point here, guys, is that Doran's Ring doesn't give flat mana regen anymore, and flat mana regen was incredibly strong in the early portion of the game. Now Doran's Ring gives 6 mana per minion kill, so this is actually a slight nerf to mana regen unless you hit basically every minion in the wave. So that is something that you need to keep in mind. And note, guys, that the focus passive, which deals additional physical damage to minions, does not stack between Tier and Doran. So if you do get an early Doran's Ring and an early Tier, that focus passive will not stack. Now, despite the changes made to Tier where it's much harder to stack in the early portion of the game, I do believe it to be a very solid early game item. The way I think we will actually see it heading into Season 11 is where people will start a Doran's Ring, they will go back for an early tempo reset, sit on the Tier, then go into it like a Ludens or another mythic item or another legendary item. They'll sit on the Tier, then upgrade it instead of Rabadons as like a second or third item later down the line, because it actually gives you a significant amount of bonus mana, which is actually quite relevant in the early portion of the game, given how hard it is to get this stat, like we mentioned earlier on within this video. So I will keep my eye out for it, but I do believe it to be a very solid early game item. Probably not something you want to start with in the early laning phase because it really doesn't give you any durability at all, doesn't give you any HP, but I do believe it to be a very solid early tempo reset item. And the last little note here, guys, is that Doran's Blade Omni-Vamp does not stack anymore. In the past, we used to see champions like Yone and Yasuo get maybe 2 or 3, sometimes even 3 Doran's Blades in the early portion of the game and actually sit on these D Blades because obviously things like Lifesteal and Omni-Vamp actually scale very nicely heading into mid-game, but now it does not stack. So you cannot stack Doran's Blades anymore, and this is very important, so please do not buy multiple Doran's Blades anymore. Now let's take a look at some of the mythic items, and the first one I really want to hone in on is Luden's Tempest. Now Luden's Tempest is actually the only AP mythic item that gives immediate flat magic penetration, and like I said earlier on in this video, guys, flat magic penetration is incredibly hard to come by, so this is something you need to keep in mind when weighing up between the AP mythic items. Now Luden's actually also gives movement speed when you proc Luden's Echo, so this is very meaningful because especially when you're playing these short trade mages, most notably Victor, Syndra, and Orianna, you get a lot of value from this movement speed in order to reposition, whether to dodge skill shots where people are trying to trade on the back end, or whether it's just to get that nice little short trade, tether a little bit more effectively, this is incredibly meaningful. Now, it's meaningful because this will largely compensate for the lack of phase rush on some of these immobile mages, which actually allows for aggressive rune choices. When I saw this item, I thought to myself immediately, holy moly, on champions like Victor, if I go lose Tempest, I don't even feel bad anymore for not going phase rush. I can actually just all in on my early laning phase, go something like Comet or Electrocute or Airy, and feel great about it. Now I have the utility and the extra damage. This is very, very important to understand. And the last little point here, guys, is that it synergizes very well with other magic penetration items, whether it's Sorks into an early Void Staff, or even maybe you get an early Darksteel. This allows you to get a very valuable early Medjai's, which, because it's so incredibly cheap as a legendary item, allows you to get value from this mythic passive, which grants 5 magic penetration per legendary item. So if you're the sole form of AP on your team, this item is incredibly attractive, and it can really allow you to snowball effectively. Or if you just want to push the pace of the game in the early game, again, this item can also be incredibly attractive, especially when paired with something like Sorks. Now, the next big thing we're going to cover is Liandry's Anguish. Now, this item doesn't really spike as hard as a one item spike comparatively to the other AP Mythics, but it does give the most ability haste out of all of the AP Mythics, but it still is very much, in my opinion, a niche item for sustained damage, mana reliant magic damage dealers, whether you're playing a champion like Cassiopeia, Swain, Annie, or Silas. So ideally, this item is paired with other durability items because it doesn't give HP anymore. If you think about the old Liandry's, it gave HP, which made sense given the identity of the item, where you want to be staying in combat for an extended period of time in order to stack up the Torment and get a lot of value from this unique passive. So this is the main reason why I believe this is actually a 2-item spike mythic, and especially when paired with something like a Demonic Embrace, which is going to give you HP, it's going to give you armor and magic resist, which allows you to stay in combat for a much longer period of time without feeling like you're just going to get one-shot or bursted before you get value from this passive. So keep this in mind if you are building it first item. Generally take your time, and make sure that you're not getting too far behind before you get that second item power spike. So the next item off the block is the Hextech Rocket Belt. This is an incredibly strong burst item, great for making single target picks, and obviously has the gap closing benefits as well as the auto attack reset ability. And due to its movement speed towards enemy champions, we will see this likely in creative ways throughout the season. Some champions that already have been seen to get a lot of value from it at the moment are champions like Galio, Echo, Fizz, Twisted Fate, and Annie. And just as a side note, guys, the wave clear portion of Proto Belt has actually been nerfed. So if you're building this item for wave clear, you're not going to get basically any value from it anymore. But the mythic passive is incredibly valuable on this item because it does give flat magic penetration. And this is one of the biggest reasons why I actually love it for Echo, Galio, and Fizz specifically, especially if you're sitting on an early Darksteel, yet maybe a pick in the early River. You turn this into an early Medjai's in combination, with a Sork Treads. You are going to be off to the races, spiking incredibly early, doing a lot of early burst damage. So I absolutely love it. And something to keep in mind, guys, if you are already close to the enemy target and you land all of the rockets, you are doing a lot of burst damage. So if you want to know more about how to utilize this item, I do talk about the old Proto Belt in my previous itemization video where I talk about the specifics of the item because it does function in a very similar way. But overall, it'll be very interesting to see how this item gets picked up in creative ways across the season. And the reason actually I mentioned Twisted Fate here is because Twisted Fate doesn't have access to Rod of Ages anymore. I actually believe Twisted Fate will be played in a much more aggressive fashion and be seen as less as a facilitator and a stun bot, and actually more of a significant, a genuine burst threat champion. So it'll be very interesting to see what other champions pick this item up across Season 11. So for Night Harvester, this is also a very solid burst item, very similar to Rocket Belt, but it has much stronger team fighting because of the ability of Soul Rend to be procced on multiple targets within a team fight, and you get movement speed within any direction, not just towards enemy champions. And we do need to remember that this item actually gives ability haste, not magic penetration within the mythic passive, which is actually quite meaningful because magic penetration, especially flat magic penetration, is very much an early game item stat, whereas ability haste is much more of a scaling stat, which makes sense given the scaling factor of this item. And so as a result of this being a very good team fighting item, I do believe we'll see this on a lot of team fighting oriented AP champions, whether it's Rumble, Echo, in certain situations, Fiddle, and Karthus. So if you want to play more for team fights and for scaling, Night Harvester is probably for you. If you want to play for picks, on single targets, and maybe spike a little bit earlier in the game, then Rocket Belt is for you. So now for Everfrost. Now, Everfrost is actually one of the better scaling AP Mythics due to its higher percent AP scaling on the Glaciate passive comparatively to the other AP Mythics. But due to its unreliability, because it's very slow to come out, has very low range, it's not like GLP at all. Right? GLP is actually a setup ability. It's a setup item, where you could spray it out from a long range, get the slow, and allow you to land your other basic abilities, whether it's a double bomb for Zillion, whether it's a Zoe bubble, or whatever champion you're playing. Whereas this ability, the way you got to view it, it's more of like a follow-up lockdown for you and your extended trades. So if you're a champion that wants to take long extended trades and keep them isolated or keep them locked down for an extended period of time, whether you're playing Annie or whether you're playing Swain or something like that, then you would get a lot of value from this item. You cannot view it like the old GOP where it allowed you to hit your normal basic abilities first. And it's very likely we'll see this item paired with things like Demonic Embrace that get a lot of value from being in combat for an extended period of time, because you can keep the enemy locked down for a very long time. So for champions like Swain, it wouldn't surprise me if we see something like Everfrost into Demonic Embrace. We may even see it creatively on champions like Anivia. Who knows? And the last little point here, guys, is that it synergizes very well with things like Ingenious Hunter and Cosmic Insight for that item haste, which we will talk a little bit later within the rune section, because it already has a very low cooldown. It actually has a 20-second cooldown already. In combination with the item haste, you can significantly reduce this cooldown, and then you can basically spam it. So it'll be very interesting to see what creative builds come out with this, especially when we see things like Ingenious Hunter and Cosmic Insight more, and what battle mages can actually utilize this specific item. So now for Riftmaker, this is a very strong AP item for any extended skirmish magic damage dealer, ideally without mana. Something like an Akali, Rumble, Mordekaiser will get a lot of value from this item. It does also work with champions that do require mana, like Cassiopeia, but if you are going to build this item, you probably need to be buying it in combination with something like an Archangels to get value from the passive, because we've got to remember, it does not give any mana. That's very important to understand. All the other AP Mythics, whether it's Ludens, whether it's Liandry's, they give a lot of base mana, so you've got to be very careful if you do build this with a champion that does require mana. And this is potentially one of the strongest items on the current patch due to Omnivamp's effectiveness, plus having percent penetration on the passive, plus having nice components that actually build this item, specifically Leeching Leer. Now, I believe Leeching Leer is a very, very solid component because it actually gives 10% Omnivamp, it gives AP, and it gives HP. So this has been an item that has just felt incredibly nice for me. I actually picked it up on Cassiopeia recently, and just sitting on the Leeching Leer, even before I finished the Riftmaker, it felt very, very nice. So this is something I need to experiment with a little bit more. But for me so far, this potentially is maybe one of the strongest items on the current patch. Now for the Lethality Mythics, and the first one off the block is the Duskblade of Drakthar. Now this item is very good for champions that require diving the backline and get value from repositioning, champions like Kha'Zix and Pyke. Now the main strength of this item is its ability haste. It has 20 flat ability haste, plus the 5 ability haste per legendary item on the mythic passive. Now, given how hard this stat is to actually spec into, like I referred to earlier on in the video, especially with the lack of ability haste on legendary items, it's an incredibly value item, and this is the main thing that you need to be considering when looking to purchase this item. Now, the trade-off for all of this ability haste is the lower lethality both on the item itself as well as not giving you the lethality per legendary item purchased. So this is, again, something that you do need to largely consider when weighing up between the items. Now, this item does leave a big question mark next to Zed in my opinion, because before you write this item off saying, oh, it has less lethality so it's going to do less damage, hear me out here. Yes, you don't really get much value from the repositioning tool of Duskblade of Drakthar with the invisibility, because you largely just pop back to your shadow anyway and just want to make the one pick then get out. You're not like a champion like Kha'Zix and Pyke that want to reposition then get another kill. Yes, I understand that. But Zed as a champion gets a lot of value from ability haste, because his W has such a long cooldown. If you can reduce that, you're going to have a lot more options to make aggressive plays. And having a lot of ability haste allows you to have access to your ultimate a lot more. This is actually one of the main reasons why Z99 used to build CDR boots and used to take Ultimate Hunter so often. So, depending on the way you want to play Zed or your interpretation of Zed's identity, this could be an item that you should definitely consider, because it has a lot of ability haste. It depends on the trade-off, guys. So we'll go through all the items, and then once you understand them all, then you can start to begin theory crafting and see what feels best for you. Now for Prowler's Claw, guys. So this is actually the highest burst option due to the damage amplification, the passive proc damage, as well as the highest lethality numbers. It is very similar to Rocket Belt in its identity, in the sense that it spikes very early. It's great at single target picks, but it doesn't give as much ability haste or utility in team fights. And note, guys, the active always puts you behind the target and can even be used on minions. So this can be used for a lot of creative playmaking potential. I think this item, at face value, a lot of people got attracted to it because, yes, it gives you the most amount of damage and people are obsessed with damage. But I think the main reason this item will be built in the future is because of how effective this is as an extra form of gap closer. So if you're playing a champion like Zed, you may be able to use this onto a minion, close the gap without having to use your W. And for all the Zed players out there, you know how valuable it is to use R first, then W, because it increases the chances of hitting a triple shuriken, which increases your damage by a massive amount. So there's a lot of creative ways to use this specific item. I've even heard that champions like Rek'Sai can use it and stay actually burrowed under the ground and then pop up as an extra gap closer. I don't know if that's true, but there's a bunch of creative ways to use this item. It'll be very interesting to see this item purchased, or how it's actually purchased heading into season 11. And again, the last little point here, this is another big question mark next to Zed. Like I said before, it will give you the ability to potentially save W. I don't know. So I'll definitely keep an open mind, and there's a lot of options for these AD assassins in the preseason. Now the next one here is Eclipse. This is a great item for 2-tap short trade champions. Champions like Renekton, Wukong, even Lucian mid, because Lucian's passive can actually proc Eclipse, can utilize this item very well. And this item allows for amazing dueling, especially in the side lane within the mid game, due to its percent max HP damage and low cooldown on the unique passive comparatively to all of the other Lethality Mythics. And on top of that, it scales the best out of all the AD lethality items because of the Omni-Vamp, and Omni-Vamp being an incredibly valuable stat heading into the mid to late game, as well as the percent armor penetration on the passive. So if you want to scale a little bit more, you're more of a short trade champion, love dueling, then this item is for you. So now for Triforce, this is a very good item for extended fights if you are able to stay in combat long enough to utilize the increased AD. We will likely see it on very sticky champions like Aurelia mid. We might even see it on things like Kled, but to be honest, Kled might even enjoy Gore Drinker, but we'll have to see about that. But just overall, very sticky champions that can stick onto their target. This will likely be paired with things like Lifesteal and Omni-Vamp, things like Ravenous Hydra and Bork for sustained combat. But I do need to test this item a lot more before I have a proper gauge on its strength relative to the other items. So I'll probably do another follow-up video later on in the future talking about this item. But for now, the only champion in the mid lane anyway that I am seeing it built on reliably is Aurelia. But I'll definitely keep an open mind, and if you have any other questions about it, feel free to ask away within the Discord. So what I'm going to do in this section, guys, is touch on a bunch of noteworthy items that I believe that are either completely misunderstood or need more clarification, or I believe are actually completely underrated. So the first one off the block is Imperial Mandate. Now, yes, this is a mythic item, but because it's not the traditional AP Mage mythic or AD Lethality mythic, I just kind of wanted to put it to the side because it is very niche. Now, this mythic is actually very interesting because I actually came about this morning within the Discord. When you pair it with Rylai's, it actually becomes a very strong 2-item spike for sustained damage champions. The initial 60 to 100 damage to champions that are slowed or immobilized has no cooldown. So for champions like Aurelia and Soul that are staying in combat for a very long time and it can actually stick on the enemy opponent, this can prove to be insane damage over the course of an extended fight. But before we go ahead with this item purchase, guys, we do need to remember and keep in mind that this item gives significantly lower base stats comparatively to all of the other AP mythics, and it doesn't give any flat mana. So if we do build this item, it is a very nice 2-item spike for specific champions, but before you get that Rylai's, you are going to be very weak. And because it actually gives percent mana base regen, that really doesn't do anything in the early portion of the game and only becomes meaningful later on within the game. So keep that in mind before you try this 2-item spike strategy. Now, the next item on the chopping block is Cosmic Drive. Now, the most itemization mistakes I've seen on the new patch is made with this single item. Yes, this item does give an insane amount of ability haste, and this is a stat that is notoriously hard to itemize, and it does synergize quite nicely with Liandry's for the extra movement speed scaling with ability haste, but it really doesn't give much damage at all. It only gives 70 ability power, no magic pen, and no damage passive, which means unless your champion gets a hell of a lot of value from ability haste and the bonus movement speed to ensure you stay on targets, it's not really an item I'd recommend. And I think a lot of people are saying, oh my god, 30 ability haste, I should get it. But it really doesn't mean a lot if you're playing like a burst-oriented champion. Yes, if you have a lot of high cooldowns and you need to spam abilities within the fight, then yes, it's very valuable. This is why we'll see it on champions like Cassiopeia, Aurelion Sol, Mordekaiser, and Swain, but they're just some of the champions that I think in theory could get a lot of value. This doesn't mean champions like Victor, Orianna, Syndra should be building this item game in, game out. It's very much a niche item. Now for Demonic Embrace. Again, this is a very niche item. So many people are viewing this like the old Liandry's, but it's not even close in terms of damage comparison. You must get value from the bonus resistances in order to make this a worthwhile purchase. Unless you are in combat as a low-range mage, this does seem like an incredibly underwhelming item. But champions that are in the action like Swain, Mordekaiser, Aurelion Sol, potentially Silas, Malzahar, Rumble will get value from this item. We may actually even see this item as an alternative to things like Banshees and Zhonya's in niche situations because it does give a decent amount of resistances, but it will be very interesting to see how this item goes within the preseason. But my hunch is again that a lot of people are actually building this item thinking that it's like the next Liandry's, but it's not even close, guys. So really keep an open mind about this item. Now for my favorite legendary item on the new patch, Lichbane. So this item actually got hotfixed from 60% AP ratio to 50% AP ratio, but I still believe it to be an incredibly strong legendary item. Because this item has actually been thinned out, removing the CDR and mana and increasing the passive cooldown by 1 second, it had its strength condensed and increased, making it more effective at doing its job, which is burst, having an extremely clear identity. It is now 200 gold cheaper than before, added an extra 75% base AD scaling onto the passive, and an extra 3% movement speed. And as a result of these changes, I do believe this item to be very strong, and I believe it will be a large contributing factor to the mid lane meta as we see it panning out over the next few weeks and months. Now for Horizon Focus. This is an incredibly strong niche item if built in the right situation. I love it because it has a very clear identity, it has obvious strengths and obvious weaknesses because it's high in damage with basically no utility. I do believe this will be seen on high range artillery mages and burst oriented champs that have access to hard CC. Two champions that spring to mind are Ahri and Syndra, and I do believe this could be an incredibly strong 2-item spike for both of these champions. This will likely be seen as a second item to ensure snowballing once ahead in the early portion of the game, and note the damage amplification on the passive is for 6 seconds. 6 seconds, which is incredibly long. So overall, I'm very optimistic about this item, and I am going to be experimenting a lot with it in the coming weeks and months. Now, the next item on the chopping block is Verdant Barrier. Now, this is an item that interests me a lot because I view it as the AP equivalent of Seekers, and the reason it's so interesting is because in the past, if you were counterpicked by a burst mage, maybe you're playing Cassiopeia into Syndra or Cassiopeia into Victor, the only access to MR you had that was just viable was a null magic mantle. And yes, later you could turn it into a Banshees, but you didn't really have many options. Now, this gives more options to these counterpicked mages in the aspect of durability. And the reason this is important is if you're versing an early Magic Pen builder and the only form of MR you had was Null Magic Mantle, you felt very limited. Now, in combination with early HP coming out of Dark Seals and Doran's Rings, this could create a lot of early durability, which can directly counter early Magic Pen buyers, especially when counterpicked. So, something I need to keep my eye on. I'd love to hear feedback from you guys in the community with your experiences with this item. But yeah, very super interesting item. And the last item we're going to look at is Nash's Truth. Now, similar to what they did with Lichbane, they've actually thinned out the item, giving it a very clear identity. By removing the 20% CDR, it actually allowed them to add in damage by increasing its AP ratio on the passive by 10% and the flat AP by 20. Now, we are already seeing this item's power rise to the surface through unique builds like the one we're seeing with Kayle, where you go straight Nash's into Riftmaker. Now, again, guys, this is an item I do need to test more in order to get an accurate gauge on its strength. and I will update you guys within the Discord community what my thoughts are on this item. But again, I do like the direction Riot is going in with these items by thinning them out, giving them a clear identity. You don't just get an item that has CDR, mana, damage, everything. You have to make a choice. Do I want the utility or do I want the damage? So again, it'll be very interesting to see how this item crops up within Season 11. Now, on the new patch, there was quite a few rune changes. So what I want to do now is take this as an opportunity to cover what I believe to be the most notable rune changes and talk about how these changes are going to affect the mid lane meta heading into Season 11 and why these changes are actually meaningful to you guys when developing your own strategies moving forward within the preseason. And the first one off the block is Ravenous Hunter. Now, Ravenous Hunter went from 1.5 flat with 2.5% per bounty hunter stack up to 14% at 5 stacks to 1% with 2% per bounty hunter stack up to 11% at 5 stacks. This is a very meaningful change due to how long it takes to actually get a meaningful amount of Omnivamp. And this will mean that we likely see champions who once before spec'd into the red tree just for Ravenous Hunter actually make different rune choices and actually just get Omnivamp from their items. A few examples are Cassiopeia going Riftmaker with Phase Rush and Secondary Precision for Presence of Mind and Legend Tenacity, or Yone getting Lifesteal from items and just specking into Secondary Resolve for Second Wind and Overgrowth. And this is just to name a few. I think this will actually have a meaningful impact on how a lot of champions spec within the red tree. And if they do spec into the red tree, they're just not going to go Ravenous Hunter anymore and go either Ingenious, Relentless, or Ultimate Hunter. So this is actually a very meaningful change. So please carefully consider whether this is something that you want to spec into, because how long it actually takes before the Omnivamp becomes meaningful takes a very long time. Now for Presence of Mind. So Presence of Mind in the past previously increased max mana or max energy on champion takedown, stacking up to 5 times. Now what it does, it actually increases mana and energy regeneration after damaging an enemy champion. But yes, you still do get the max mana or energy restoration off a takedown, but it has been reduced to 15% from 20%. Now what this means is that we will likely see this rune on champions that actively need to use their offense as their defense to buy time to scale, or like to be in combat often and actually heavy trade quite often. So for champions like Cassiopeia, Akali, Sylas, and Azir, I think we will still see Presence of Mind. And to be honest with you guys, you may hate me for this, but I actually really like these changes, like I mentioned before within the mana section of this video, because of how easy this was to abuse for so many champions in regards to just increasing your max mana pool. Like, it was ridiculous. So many champions were specking into this, getting a few early kills or early gank, and then just completely changing the way your kit actually operates. So I'm very happy with the way Riot actually made these changes. I actually think it makes the game much more interesting. I think it puts a lot of priority on that second rotation blue buff. And I think people need to be a lot more careful with the way they itemize now, rather than just getting mana from everywhere and getting a lot of value from things like Archangels. And even for energy users like Akali and Zed and things like that, they need to be much more careful with the way they use their abilities. So very happy with this, has a very clear identity, and it'll be very interesting to see the effects of this heading into Season 11. Now, there were also significant changes to Conqueror. Now, in regards to the adaptive force, it went from 1.7 to 4.2 from levels 1 to 18 to 2 to 5 from levels 1 to 18. And in terms of the healing at max stacks, it went from 15% at max stacks for melee champions, and it was actually at 8% for range, to 9% for melee champions, at 6% for range champions. So these were very significant changes. Now, what does this actually mean? Now, Riot's intention with these changes was to make this more of a damage-oriented rune, rather than one of sustain. And to be honest with you guys, this isn't really a nerf at all. It's actually somewhat of a buff, because the healing portion of this rune was actually more of a luxury. The damage was the main reason most people took this rune anyway. So for champions that took this rune in the past, they are very much going to take it again in the future. And to be honest with you, if you were unsure in a given matchup whether you wanted to take Conqueror or Fleet, I think this is actually going to increase the incentive to take Conqueror, especially in those melee versus melee matchups. And I actually really like the direction this Conqueror rune is going, because less healing is more healthy for the game, because there's already so much healing through itemization within the game. And on top of that, it does just give this rune a very clear identity comparatively to what it was before. So overall, I think this will be very interesting to see how it plays out, especially within those melee versus melee matchups in the mid lane, whether it's on Yone, Akali, Sylas, and Yasuo. Now for Ingenious Hunter and Cosmic Insight. So Ingenious Hunter now gives item haste, and remember that item haste actually affects all item cooldowns, not just actives, which is actually incredibly nice. And actually, given the nerfs to Ravenous Hunter, like I mentioned before, we will likely see a lot more priority on these other options, especially Ingenious Hunter. And Cosmic Insight does the same thing, giving 10 item haste, but it also gives 15 summoner spell haste. But I do believe we will see a lot more priority on this rune, potentially even over Magical Footwear and Biscuits, due to how meaningful the item passive and actives are on this patch, with the likes of things like Rocket Belt, Night Harvester, Ludens. All of them are just incredibly valuable at the moment, so wouldn't surprise me if we see a lot more priority on these two runes. So just a few things to consider on this patch, guys. Rushing Mythics isn't always essential. There will be plenty of champions on this patch that actually want to rush a legendary item first instead, or sometimes even get a mythic as a third item way later down the line. There are champions like Lucian that I believe will still get a lot of value from going something like Essence into Navori, maybe into a third item Shield Bow. Or maybe Lucian just goes Sanguine Blade into something else, into a mythic as a third item. I know there are a bunch of top champions that as well aren't always rushing mythics. So keep an open mind. Don't always feel like you have to rush mythics, because we must remember that the mythic passive, which gives you the extra whatever the stat is upon buying a legendary, doesn't even register until you build the legendary anyway. So building a mythic second item is still completely fine. And I said this before in my previous video, guys, you must be thinking about the identity of your champion and the way it wants to play fights and the way it wants to play trades before you go around blindly trying items. Now with this video, hopefully you understand a little bit more about how the items actually work. You need to understand your identity, because like I said before, guys, the way Riot is actually pushing itemization, you need to be very careful about what stats you really want. Do you really want a lot of ability haste, or do you want a lot of burst, or do you want a lot of durability? You can't have everything within one item. So please be, or at least have a lot of intention with what you're building, because it must be tied directly to your champion's identity. And there will be a lot more hotfixes, a lot more changes coming across the next few weeks and months, so don't feel bad if your champion has limited options. Riot will inevitably fix this over time. And note, guys, tier lists are just not possible yet. If you do see a tier list somewhere, take it with a grain of salt, because there's no possible way of knowing what the mid lane meta is right now. It's going to take a lot more time. People are still figuring out optimal build paths. Until all of the optimal build paths are figured out on all of the champions, we're not going to know or have an accurate representation of the relative strength of the champion. So keep an open mind and take it with a grain of salt if you do see one online. Now, before I end this video, guys, I want to share my initial thoughts on the current meta. Again, take this with a grain of salt, because the meta hasn't really been solved yet. The items haven't been out for long, but these are just my initial thoughts, all right? So these three are champions that really spring to mind in terms of strong champions. I would say Fizz and Echo specifically are strong because of how nice Lichbane feels right now, and they get a lot of value from Lichbane, as well as Rocket Belt feeling incredibly nice on both of these champions, as well as how strong I believe Darkseal is on the current meta, on the current patch, sorry, as well as, like I mentioned before, how gold efficient it is, and turning it into a Magi is incredibly valuable for a cheap legendary item. Victor, again, gets a lot of value from Lichbane, sorry, but I do think Victor is strong for a multitude of reasons. I think the Ludens changed that give him extra bit of movement speed, allow him to not feel terrible for not opting in for Phase Rush, so he can actually go a much more lane-oriented rune. I would also say he gets a lot of value again from Lichbane. He gets a lot of value from this Darkseal, and just the overall Victor changes where he doesn't have to buy his Hex Cores make him feel like a very nice champion. These are some other champions that I have seen to be quite successful so far in my games. I think Akali with Riftmaker is very strong. Yone with the on-hit build with Rageblade into Shield Bow is quite nice. Kiana and Zed with all the lethality items are quite nice. I think Galio with Rocket Belt is super interesting, something I want to test a lot more, but I think has a lot of potential. And Katarina as well, I think has a lot of build options, and I think will get seen a lot especially within preseason and early season 11. Now, these are a few champions I'm keeping an eye on, and champions that I think have a lot of potential heading into season 11. And the first one here is actually Swain. Now, this is a little bit of a meme in my Discord, because I have been known to be a bit of a Swain hater, but with the item changes, I think this champion has a lot of potential, and it is something I want to test out within this preseason. A few other ones here, notable mentions, Vel'Koz, I think it could work, even though the mana changes do screw him over a little bit. I do think he will be a very strong burst mage, but again, I'll keep an eye on it. Annie, I think Annie has a lot of different item builds right now. I think gets a lot of value from Leandri's, obviously, gets a lot of value from Proto Belts. Ludens gets a lot of value from a lot of these items, so super interesting to see how Annie pans out and the way her identity shapes and forms. I would say Kale is something that interests me with the new Nashers and Riftmaker. Aurelion Soul with that Imperial Mandate Rylai's build I think is interesting. Twisted Fate with Protobelt is interested in me. Silas has a lot of interesting build paths, whether it's Leandri's, whether it's Everfrost, whether it's Rocket Belt. I think, again, Silas has a lot of options, so I'll keep an open mind with that one. I think Rumble, again, another interesting one, similar to Swain in the sense of these battle mages have a lot of item paths, and I think that they can get things done. I'm going to talk to Went, the Rumble one trick, a lot more about this champion, but I am very, very much interested in how Rumble is going to pan out within the preseason. Diana is one that has snuck up on me. I think in the previous patch, she didn't really have an identity. The items didn't give her a direction. But right now, with all of these new burst-oriented items, I think she has a very clear identity. And I'm super interested to see how she pans out. Rise, yes, on paper, he may seem dog shit because of the lack of mana. But whenever a meta changes, there is always some weird niche tanky Rise build that props up out of nowhere. So I am keeping an eye on Rise, and I will probably try and talk to a few Rise players to see their thoughts on this champion. And then Nocturne. The reason I put Nocturne here is, again, the AD lethality items interest me. I think they're very nice. And with those Tiamat changes, yes, it's harder to build, but it does proc off abilities as well. That interests me. So Nocturne is another champion I am keeping my eye on. I'll keep you guys updated as I find out more on all of these champions. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully this sets you on the right path heading into Season 11. If you have any more questions, I'll try and get to as many of you as possible within the comment section. Cheers and good luck with your theory crafting within the preseason.